book in the field, Kaigun. It was the best carrier design before the arrival of the SS class. But how important this carrier was to the Imperial Japanese Navy, it had participated in almost every major naval battles of the Pacific War, except the Battle of Midway. It was participated in the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, the Battle of Coral Sea, or even the Guadalcanal campaign. Her sister ship, Shogaku, was sunk in the Battle of Philippine Sea, and so she was the last carrier that participated in the attack of Pearl Harbor to be sunk. And so I'm going to talk about what the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned in the previous battle and what they had implemented specifically on the carrier and what is the limitation of this lesson learning process. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share my view that the sunk of Drekago was an unexpected battle damage that sealed the fate of the carrier. But the first item, the experience learned from the Battle of Philippine Seas was not directly related to the carrier. Well, it is because the report of the carrier, the after action report of the carrier in the Battle of Philippine Seas, the Mariana Turkish King, was destroyed, I believe that. And the after action report of Shogaku, it is not entirely destroyed. Yeah, you could still find the content page there. I don't know what is the use about that. But still, the after action report of the 653rd Flying Corps served on board the carrier in the 3rd Carrier Division was still intact. And long story short, what they had concluded from the previous battle, they believed that the massive losses, at least in aircraft or airmen, were because of the radar technology and enjoyed by the United States Navy, and also the effective combat air patrol directed by the carrier with the intelligence and the early warning from the radar system. And so they concluded 5 aspects of war experience to overcome the problem. The first one is the fighter cover, and the second one is about the aircraft and the airmen of both the carrier, and the third one is the air recon and the combat air patrol. The fourth one is about communications and radar, and finally is about the battlefield intelligence. Well, one reminder, I'm not going to entirely read the verse on my PowerPoint. It's just a backup case just in case if you all can't hear about my voice, you can read the script. Or if you just think that my English is so broken, you can read the script too. Well, so yeah, I'm sorry about for my Hong Kong accent. Yeah. Well, let's continue. So how about the fighter cover? Well, according to the report, they just believe that the air cover for the attack aircraft is entirely not enough, just because the United States Navy could direct their fighters concentrated to launch and surprise the attack to the Japanese attack aircraft. And the limited fighters, I don't know how about the numbers, they did not write that in the report, were not enough to stop the United States Navy's fighters to do their job. So they suggest that they had to double the fighter escort. Also, I don't know how about the numbers. They just write that. But they have specifically mentioned that the fighters should start fighting with the USNCAP 5 minutes before the attack aircraft arrive. And they also suggest that if the fighter escort was doubled, and if they could perfectly engage with the United States Navy's fighters as planned, it had a higher possibility for their own attack aircraft to slip through the US and fleet air defense. And the second experience they have generated is about the aircraft and the airmen. Long story short, they believe that their spare parts and the fuselage on the aircraft carrier was not enough, and that has to be increased to at least 33% of the operational aircraft aboard. And also, they believe that they had to reduce the types of the aircraft on the carrier. And it was not only about the operational or the logistic or the maintenance work. It was also related to the kamikaze tactics come later. They believe that once the kamikaze tactics is going to implement it, the bombers would be in shortage. And so they will have to rely on the fighters to do the fighter escort or even become the fighter bomber. And they also believe that since there is only one airman on a fighter, if they replaced more bombers with the fighters, and they could have more place for more fighters and less air crew for every aircraft. And also, they believe that the fighter bomber would be more efficient in a surprise attack or if they are being attacked, since it was a fighter after all. And the third lesson is about the air reconnaissance and the combat air patrol, the CAP. And first, and their opinion about the air recon was that it was entirely unsatisfying. The poor situational awareness and the poor target positions made the intelligence were not accurate enough, or they never returned back to the carrier fast enough. And also, the poor target position had another problem. It was the poor navigating ability, which prolonged the time for the scout planes, for the attack aircraft, if they could went back to the carrier. And also the fighter, they will have to have a prolonged time to return to carrier. And their solution was to suggest more training on navigation, scouting, and also urge the air crew to bear the civilian duties together. And there is also one suggestions related to the Type 97 torpedo bombers, which was served as scout planes on the small aircraft carrier, which was they're just too old. They were not suitable for the battlefield now. And for the CAP, they had expressed their idea under the catalog of the air reconnaissance. And I don't know why, but they mentioned that there was too few fighters on top of the fleet or on the aircraft carrier under the USN airstrike in the previous battle. And there was only 4 fighters as the CAP for Drekago in the last battle. And it comes to the reason why they put that CAP under the air reconnaissance. It was because they believed that in the coming battle, the CAP had to bear the responsibility to air reconnaissance or even to watch out for the incoming USN airstrike or the aircraft incoming. And this suggests that the USN airstrike should be detected at least 30 minutes earlier. And the other suggestions related to a more proper CAP was better communications and cooperation between the fighter and the fighter direction system. And also, they suggest that the carrier should bear some fan or foe identification devices. But interestingly, they were contented with the surface visual photo system. And the fourth experience is about the communication and the airborne radar. And long story short, they just complained that their existing airborne radio sets were just ineffective. And they even suggest that they should all be removed and have some more advanced, more lighter, and less bulky models to replace them. And for the radar, they suggested the airborne radar were unreliable and they keep malfunctioning during the operation, and also they were jamming their own radio communications. And there is also one lesson they had generated from the previous battle, which was about the radio transmission room on the carrier. And they discovered that the radio transmission room in different parts of the carrier would affect their transmission capability. And the last experience they had generated was about the battlefield intelligence. Probably they had suffered very great losses thanks to the USN fighter control. So they suggest that to cope with the USN fleet air defense system, they should have an aircraft installed with an air-to-air radar. And so such aircraft could stay in the front line to provide some front line intelligence to the fighter and to direct the friendly fighters to intercept the US and CAP, and also to warn the Imperial Japanese Navy attack aircraft to avoid the interceptor. And probably they had realized that such an aircraft could never come in time. So they had another alternative suggestions, which was to install a radio direction finder on a scout plane for some early warning, better than none. And interestingly, they had mentioned that they should try to intercept the USN radio transmission, and they suggest that they could even sending some fake message to the USN aircraft. But however, they had realized that such fake message required about average English capability, and they probably were quite pessimistic about that. And so we come to the second part, the preparation work of Drekago for the next battle. As I have mentioned, the after-action report of the Battle of Philippine Seas were inaccessible, probably destroyed at the end of the war. But however, from the after-action report of her final battle, there are about 8 pages regarding the preparation work for the carrier. And it could be divided into 2 major aspects for the preparation, which was the improvements in equipment and armament. And another aspect was to improve the capability of the damage control system. And generally speaking, they suggested there should be more radio sets to strengthen the communications between the carrier and the aircraft, and also between the aircraft, the fighters, and the fighters themselves. They suggested more telegraph or more radio sets could be provided for the squadronal communications or for the fighter direction. But however, the radio set increased was quite limited, not more than 10 at all for each types. And for the damage control system, they suggest that the watertight compartments should be improved and the flammable materials should be removed from the ship, or at least relocated to some underwater line compartment. And probably they had a very painful experience of the loss of carrier Daihor. A very new aircraft carrier participated in the Battle of Philippine Seas and were sunk after a USN submarines launched a torpedo and scored a hit and caused some very serious gasoline leakage. And so they suggested they have implemented a massive increase in the ventilators. They had replaced the existing 3 ventilators in the hangars with more powerful units, and they had another additional 15 ventilators installed in the venters or inside the ship. And what I would like to talk a little bit more specific was the improvement in the AA defense. In 1941, when the ship was commissioned, she was carrying 8 twin-mounted 5-inch AA guns and 42 25 mm AA gun. But at her final battle, there were another 20 triple-mounted 25 AA gun, and also they were all remote power controlled by the director. And also they had increased another 2 sets of the air search radar. Well, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. And well, thanks to the advantages, I'm still sitting in Hong Kong. I could keep doing some last-minute changes to my presentation, and you could see 2 pictures in my PowerPoint here, and I just discovered them 6 hours before this presentation. And the right one is a graph showing the fleet formation of Drekago and her escorting vessels. And the middle one was a more proper graph drawn by the Japanese authority post-war. Well, and you can see the red circle here is the carrier Drekago. She was surrounded by the light cruisers, and you can see the battleship easy and other formation here. And you could see on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see they have drawn the first wave of the attack aircraft, pass through the second group, and going straight forward to the first group. And as I'm running out of time, but thank God I'm not going to detailedly talk about the battle, the course of the battle here. And I'm just going to talk about one bomb strike on the aircraft and another torpedo, which I believe that it had sealed the fate of the carrier. Well, the final battle was begun at 7 o'clock in the morning, 25 October, and there were 3 waves of attack. The USA attack air group was detected 240 kilometers away, but they were only eyesighted as close as 6,000 meters. And there were only 10 fighters as the combat air patrol on top of the aircraft. And in 8:35, a 250 kilogram bomb hit the administrative flight deck about here. And 2 minutes later, a torpedo scored a hit at the port quarter, destroyed the 4th generator room. But why these 2 battle damage were so critical? The bomb disabled the power supply of a gun group, according to report of the 25mm AA gun, and which made them impossible to direct by the director. And the torpedo hit near the 4th generator room, destroyed the entire generator room, and there were no more power supplies for the follow the pointer indicator. Long story short, after these 2 attacks, at least the port side of the aircraft carrier had lost AA capability, and also a 9.5 degree listing to port side. Well, as a result, in the second and the third waves of the attack, there were no more CAP on top of the carrier because of the flight deck damage. Is still very serious listing and more serious. And also, the flooding of the ship had made the AA guns, the remaining AA guns could not be resupplied properly. And also, as the power was called out, even the 12 cm AA rockets could not be operational under the director. They could only practice some local fire control, and they were effective in morale, but not at all in the real battle. Even the Japanese say that. And so, as a result, the ship was sunk, and here comes to my conclusion as I'm running out of time. Oh, well, as you have seen, the Imperial Japanese Navy's preparation of war was inspired by the previous war experience, and they have did that. They had realized the USM fleet's defense was strong, and they should have some improvement on AA, more proper communications and control, and better damage control. But however, this lesson learning and the adaptation was limited by the resources, by the technology, and the time. Well, the new guns, the new aircraft carriers, and new equipment could never be invented or be supplied on time. With the existing equipment, the change in quantity could not track code with the advancing US attacking tactics or the technology. And also, the United States Navy's simulated airstrike could overrun the AA easily, which the Japanese Navy did it at least once while they were sinking the HMS Prince of Wales. Sorry for the typo. And well, the carrier had stood up for attack for the half day, but however, just 1 torpedoes and 1 bomb had caught out her combat capability and its defense system. I would conclude that as an unexpected battle damage sealed the fate of the carrier, just like the sink of HMS Prince of Wales in her final battle. Well, and that's end for my presentation. I'm sorry about a little bit overrun of time, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cater. Next up is Chris Himmler. Sir, you have the floor. And sorry about that feedback, by the way. That was all my fault. I was logging into the virtual part of this panel so I could message Cater directly and totally screwed that up with the sound. So sorry. My bad.
All right.
You have 20 minutes, Chris.
Yes, sir. Starting. Mark, thank you for a warm and unsolicited introduction. Despite your connection with the University of Alabama, I continue to think of you as a close friend and a valued colleague. So thank you. We're up. Go to the first slide, please. On 23 February 1945, 40 U.S. Marines scaled the 550-foot peak of Mount Suribachi on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. Moments after cresting the height, the patrol discovered a nearby iron pipe, lashed an American ensign to its end, and raised the national colors over the battlefield below. As a second larger flag went up, AP photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped his iconic photograph. Through heroic resolve, the image seemed to say, the Marines had overcome a tenacious Japanese enemy. This is perhaps the image Admiral Nimitz had in mind when he said that uncommon valor was a common virtue. Heartening and patriotic, however, as this story may seem, the simple narrative fails to capture the full story of American triumph in the Pacific. Brave infantrymen, though indispensable, did not win the conflict alone. Behind the bayonet and nerve of Marine riflemen on Iwo Jima was a highly evolved network of what this study terms trifibious firepower. Fire from land, sea, and air. On D-Day alone, American ships delivered more than 1,900 16-inch, 1,500 14-inch, and 30,000 5-inch shells. That's on D-Day alone. F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats screamed overhead at 400 miles per hour while dropping 101,000-pound bombs on stubborn enemy positions. Once ashore, 105 and 75 millimeter howitzer shells, along with 81 millimeter mortar rounds, joined the orchestra. On Iwo Jima, as elsewhere in the Central Pacific, the progress of the infantrymen was dependent upon robust and continuous fire support from the sea and sky. Next slide, please. By the eve of the battle, few Japanese officers or troops on Iwo Jima expected to survive the looming contest. But Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi was determined to sell his island at a handsome price. The outpost boasted 642 concrete pillboxes, 120 large naval guns, 130 howitzers, 60 anti-tank guns, and 20,000 small arms. Kurabayashi banned piecemeal banzai attacks and directed his 23,000-man detachment to die loyally in their hardened bunkers. Anticipating the violence to come, the general himself placed his command post 75 feet below the surface. If the island presented a tactical challenge, and it certainly did, the Americans meant to respond with mass. Task Force 58, with 16 total carriers, would provide aviation support, 3 battleship divisions, 1 cruiser division, 3 destroyer divisions would assume shore bombardment responsibilities. The 71,000 Marines of the 5th Amphibious Corps would take the beach. The combined outfit totaled 111,308 troops and 495 ships. As had become custom by 1945, the United States would fight from a position of quantitative supremacy. In the early hours of D-Day on Iwo Jima, after 3 days of preliminary shelling, the Americans mounted their most ambitious fire support coordination effort of the entire war. Battleships and destroyers worked from a choreographed timeline to deconflict effort and maximize destructive fire over the landing zones. This naval deluge eventually gave way to a flurry of aerial activity. 55 minutes before the arrival of the landing force, 36 fighter planes, 18 torpedo bombers, and 18 dive bombers struck Iwo Jima from above. The aviators focused their fire on the immediate landing beaches as well as the slopes of Mount Suribachi. 35 minutes before the Marines touched down, the planes concluded their barrage and passed the fire support baton back to the sailors at sea. On cue, warships resumed their blitz. The USS California focused 5 and 14-inch steel projectiles on the eastern landing beaches, while battleships Mississippi, New York, and Nevada took to their own fire sectors. Several of the ships closed within 1,000 yards of Iwo's black sand. The The decision to place them so close to the shoreline was bold, yet in the risk lay the handsome reward. With more reliable communications, better direct observation, and shorter firing trajectories, the nearby positions allowed U.S. ships to deliver more accurate and more responsive support. Next slide, please. The Americans' next move represented what I would argue is the most innovative fire support tactic of the battle and arguably of the entire Pacific War. For several weeks, the 5th Corps' naval gunfire officer, this man pictured here, Donald Weller, had drafted and refined an audacious plan to protect the infantry through the most vulnerable stage of the attack. While the Marines bobbed ashore and prepared to touch the beach, Weller's shore fire control teams attempted a naval rolling barrage, the first of its kind in the history of amphibious warfare. Through the bold gamble, Weller intended to, quote, wring the last ounce of potential out of the naval gun and provide the Marines a timely antidote against Kurabayashi's fortress. This rolling barrage concept initially appeared on the bloody battlefields of the First World War. Searching for tactical solutions to break the hellish stalemate, British, French, and German officers attempted to precede their infantry assaults with a mobile curtain of firepower. If applied properly, the creeping artillery fire, in this case landed artillery, would neutralize the enemy and allow friendly infantry to advance across no man's land. Without radio communications, however, World War I armies depended upon prescriptive timetables to coordinate their action. But timetables, as most any combat veteran can attest, rarely work in war. When the pace of an infantry attack accelerated or stalled, the rolling barrage was derailed. In the worst of cases, it threatened friendly troops in the attack. This dilemma between safety and effectiveness was unavoidable. The Great War's rolling barrage remained elementary and occasionally disastrous in practice. Weller expected more on Iwo Jima. As their landing craft came within 400 yards of the beach, American naval gunfire would methodically crawl up the sand. Aerial observers would record the progress of the landing force and arrange coordination in real time over assigned radio channels. As the Marines advanced through 100-yard blocks, the overhead conductors would direct the ships to shift their fire. In this naval application, the sheer destructiveness of the battleship compounded the risk. A single projectile from a 16-inch naval gun weighed the same as a standard passenger car. Should coordination fail at the beachhead, Weller acknowledged, quote, you might just cream the hell out of some of your own troops. In the weeks prior to the battle, he wrestled with this danger. Quote, I had a lot of sleepless nights, I can tell you that, because it had never been done before. Just as the first wave of LVTs came within 400 yards of the beach, the 5th Corps triggered its rolling barrage. Airborne observers transmitted updates to each warship, and the American curtain of gunfire crept 200 yards up the beach. At exactly 9:02 in the morning, matching the progress of the landing force, the battleships rolled their fire another 200 yards inland. As the shelling rolled up the coast, the Marines encountered Iwo's soft volcanic ash, steep terrace grades, and Japanese machine gun fire. Upon their arrival, Weller's shore fire control parties, to include forward observers and liaison officers, assumed responsibility for adjusting this rolling naval barrage. The observers from each control party quickly established radio communications with their firing ships and adjusted the naval rounds according to the advance of the infantry. The result was a tailored and responsive application of sea-based fire. Just as the innovative bombardment had helped to put the Marines ashore, so too it protected their subsequent advance. Navy Yeoman James Raines aboard destroyer Haworth proudly recalled his sense of satisfaction. Quote, when we started firing in the morning, we were shooting about the middle of the island. Later, we shifted more to the left, and then again. We kept moving left all day, stopping several times while our Marines closed up the front. It was like playing checkers. We kept jumping ahead all the time. As the coordination teams and gunners coordinated and executed their firing missions, staff reps from the 5th Corps monitored radio frequencies and passively screened the requests from a unified command tent. If the Corps' air, artillery, or naval gunfire representative deemed the request either unsafe or redundant, he intervened and adjusted the mission. This nerve center became a one-stop shop for fire support management, and it picked up the colloquial title, Supporting Arms Tent. This would come to be known, what the Marines call today the Fire Support Coordination Center. This is its infancy here on Iwo Jima. Throughout the process, close personal liaison and mutual trust drove the effectiveness of American fire support. Overwhelming naval firepower remained essential to the Marines' advance. Now well established ashore, fire control teams ensured precise coordination between entities. On the 21st of February, Robert Sherrod, a veteran journalist and no stranger to amphibious bombardments, recorded, quote, "the greatest concentration of fire I had ever seen." The destruction wrought by American combined arms contributed to some of the most brutal combat in the history of warfare. Sherrod continued his summary in this way. Again, I quote, "Whether the dead were Japanese or American, they had one thing in common. They had died with the greatest possible violence. Nowhere in the Pacific War had I seen such badly mangled bodies. Many were cut squarely in half. Legs and arms lay 50 feet away from a body." End quote. I would mention that Sherrod was present at the assault on Tarawa in 1943. Others not only acknowledged but contributed to the war's surging inhumanity. Yeoman Rains, again aboard USS Howorth, described his compassionless pride in a letter to his wife. Quote, "I'm glad that I had something to do with killing some of them. I feel really grand about it. I only wish I were in close enough to see their bodies go sky high when our shells hit." Ashore, a Japanese lieutenant endured the barrage of Rain and his fellow gunners. "Men didn't just die on Iwo Jima," the lieutenant wrote. "They were ripped apart, torn to shreds, and scattered." Destruction on Iwo Jima was not solely the result of American naval gunfire and infantry action. Perhaps in an attempt to match the naval gunners' rolling barrage, Marine air coordinators introduced their own revolutionary technique. Previously, all aviation support had been arranged and controlled from Navy command centers afloat. Although air liaison parties managed requests and advised ground commanders ashore, they did not direct aircraft in flight. Such control authority remained at sea. The Fifth Corps' imaginative Vernon E. McGee, however, pictured here, believed that the control centers were too far removed from the action. They lacked an appreciation for the tactical situation, and they lacked an understanding of the progress, rather an accuracy of the progress of the landing force. McGee proposed a better solution, an awkwardly labeled Landing Force Air Support Control Unit, or LFASQ in the equally cumbersome acronym. Instead of relying on the Navy's sea-based air control, McGee insisted that Marine-led teams should manage their own aircraft from the beach. Air control in an amphibious landing, he argued, could not reside, quote, "out on some ship," end quote, where the sailors, quote, "couldn't see what was going on." Furthermore, their preference for pre-planned timetables meant that, again, McGee's words, "the poor devil up there on the front line that needed air support now couldn't get it," end quote. With more flexible and proximate control, American close air support could achieve its fullest potential. Aircraft could strike targets with greater precision, they could wear down reinforced enemy bunkers, and they could prosecute reverse slope positions, that most elusive of targets for the naval gun. McGee's concept became reality on the beach of Iwo Jima, when his 70-man team assumed control of all supporting air operations, close supporting air operations, on 1 March 1945. Immediately adjacent to the landing force command post, McGee's pioneers began directing all strike missions, combat air patrols, tactical air observer flights, and miscellaneous aircraft. The LFASQ introduced an array of procedural modifications meant to improve the precision, safety, and effectiveness of American close air support. For each strike, air control radio operators would announce the mission number, the target coordinates, the attack timeline, the heading, and the minimum strike altitude over a common radio frequency. The broadcast allowed howitzer batteries and mortar teams to adjust their own missions according to that pilot data. Artillery fire directors would respond with their own maximum ordnance, or the highest shell altitude of their firing missions, so that nearby aircraft could remain clear of the danger. In the most critical circumstances, McGee's radio man had authority to order a complete ceasefire for all American gunners, thereby allowing American pilots to make a risky pass over an urgent Japanese target. For the most dynamic moments of fire support, LFASQ-1, as it was labeled, initiated a novel coordination measure dubbed Plan Victor. Plan Victor stipulated that when mortar and artillery units were firing within 2,500 yards of an aircraft target, all land-based fires would stay below 1,100 feet. That artificial ceiling allowed American pilots to bomb and strafe with impunity under the special circumstances of the plan. The technique allowed McGee's men to safely combine, quote, the terrific firepower of the air and sea arms. In the first day of March, the Marine El Fascu earned and then sustained resounding approval from the units and commanders that it supported on Iwo Jima. One Navy officer concluded that McGee's system, quote, far surpassed anything that has ever gone before in air support operations. He continued, for the control of troop support missions, a landing force air support control unit is an absolute necessity. American planes, ships, and field cannons continued to support the Marines' attack as the cycle of violence raged ashore. March 1945 became a broken record for the Marines, a broken record defined by constant explosions and an inescapable longing for the whole bloody nightmare to end. One infantry company expended 400 hand grenades in a 30-minute attack. In another skirmish, tankers fired 1,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel on a single Japanese blockhouse. Even while clearing bunkers, Marine units clung to American trifibious fire support. Aircraft proved especially valuable in exposing hardened underground and those reverse slope positions that I mentioned. Infantry commanders invited unprecedented risk in order to drain the last drop of fire support from the ships trolling offshore. In several cases, Joint Assault Signal Company teams coordinated naval fire just 75 yards from friendly positions. I'll remind you that the 16-inch shell weighs the same as a standard passenger car. 75 yards is fairly close. Behind air and naval firepower, companies crawled forward with flamethrowers, tanks, dynamite, and hand grenades. Though skirmishing would remain, in the evening hours of 16 March, the 5th Amphibious Corps declared Iwo Jima secure. Even by the standards of the Pacific War, U.S. ordnance expenditures were truly astonishing. Marine artillery fired some 450,000 rounds on Iwo Jima. One howitzer battalion averaged 973 rounds per day throughout the month-long operation. Kurobayashi's staff estimated that American ships delivered 30,000 shells per day. Navy and Marine pilots contributed another 1,315 tons of bombs and rockets from the sky. Kurobayashi himself, remember the Japanese commander, acknowledged the decisive role of air and naval fires. From his underground bunker and prior to his death on Iwo Jima, the general remarked that, quote, I am not afraid of the fighting power of only 3 American Marine divisions if there are no bombardments from aircraft and warships. But howitzer shells, naval munitions, and aerial bombs cannot coordinate themselves in battle. The deluge required careful application and integration. American shorefire control parties, air liaison parties, and joint assault signal companies, alongside McGee's trailblazing air support unit, arranged and adjusted this avalanche of American firepower. When one frontline Marine concluded that, quote, close coordination between air, ground, and sea units was excellent throughout the entire campaign, that credit belongs to American coordination teams. In organization, training, and tactics, these specialized parties had matured through more than 2 years of brutal combat in the South and Central Pacific. Against Kurobayashi's extraordinary defensive scheme, these specialists proved their value and solidified their reputation as a critical component of Allied warmaking. Though the Marine infantrymen provided the final ingredient, it was American trifibious fire support that enabled victory in the Pacific. Thank you.
19 minutes. Really good. Really good. Thank you, Chris. Roll Tide. Speaking of coordination. Roll Tide. All right. Jim, you're up, sir.
All right.
You have 21 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I'll take tips after we're done. All right, I'm gonna mask as well. Otherwise, you just hear mumble, 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 right? Well, good afternoon, everybody. So despite the independent nature of their operations, World War II submarines required significant support from ashore. In Manila, home of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, this organization was the squadron commander and his staff. They were responsible for directing the operations of the assigned submarines on the behalf of the fleet commander. They oversaw the training and material condition of their assigned submarines and crews, and controlled the communications, facilitated their operations. When they ordered the boats into port, they ensured they'd be replenished with torpedoes, fuel, spare parts, and food, and that vital repairs would be completed. They collected and disseminated lessons learned from recent operations and certified the boats ready for their next patrol. Submarines could not perform their duties without this vital organization. This paper evaluates the staff leadership of Asiatic Fleet submarines. Two officers stand out for leading their force in challenging circumstances. I argue that despite the disappointing performance of their assigned submarines, these men performed admirably in preparing their boats for war, in executing their operational plan in the face of adversity, in reassessing and adapting as events unfolded, in making major decisions that affected their force, and in assessing submarine performance to recommend changes. This is a story of tenacity, with few successes and many failures. However, their performance is significant to the eventual improved performance of U.S. submarines in World War II. Slide. All right, Manila had the largest concentration of modern American submarines in December 1941. Slide. Admiral Thomas Hart, fleet commander. Another slide. Yeah, there he is, Tommy Hart. He was the fleet commander. He was himself a submariner, and he had high hopes for their success. Slide. Commander John Wilkes, USNA 1916, was the senior submarine officer on Hart's staff. He was tall and tough, an excellent athlete in college. He was described as being somewhat of a martinet, with a stern and irascible demeanor. Wilkes commanded one of the first prototype fleet boats and a submarine division in Manila in 1939 before he assumed command of the squadron there. Slide. In November 1941, another squadron of 12 modern fleet boats with their submarine tender Holland arrived in Manila as reinforcements for Hart's small fleet, creating something of an organizational dilemma. Wilkes was due to rotate back to the U.S., and Hart could ill afford to lose his experience and knowledge of Western Pacific operations, the boats, and the skippers. His designated relief, Commander James Fife, USNA 1918, had just arrived, but was significantly junior to Captain Walter Doyle, USNA 1913, who commanded the newly arrived squadron. Doyle had worked for Hart in the mid-1930s at the Naval Academy when Hart was superintendent. He commanded a fleet boat and the tender Holland, but otherwise had an unremarkable career. Hart had never been impressed with him. By Navy convention, as the senior officer, Doyle should relieve Wilkes. But Hart's solution was to have Fife, a cerebral and highly respected submariner, serve as Doyle's chief of staff. Fife had served as naval attaché to Great Britain in 1940-41. After returning to the U.S., he visited Navy commands to present his observations, including briefing Hart in Manila. Hart's submarine force now included 23 modern fleet boats and 6 elderly S-class boats. He decided an organizational change was required for the war that he believed was imminent. He dissolved the administrative structure of submarine squadrons with multiple divisions. The new organization was designated Commander Submarines U.S. Asiatic Fleet, or CSAF. With the submarines now the Asiatic Fleet's most powerful striking force, the reorganization would optimize the focus on supporting wartime operations. On December 1st, the day that CSAF was officially established, Doyle relieved Wilkes. Hart ordered Wilkes to remain in the Philippines, eyeing the deteriorating strategic situation with Japan and looking to maintain an ace in the hole. Wilkes stayed as a special advisor to Doyle. Fife and 5 former submarine division commanders, all post-command officers of high abilities, supported Doyle. And so the Japanese struck, as we know, on December 8th. Their initial air attacks decimated General Douglas MacArthur's air forces. As a result, the enemy was able to operate over the Philippines and surrounding seas with little opposition from American air power. CSAF deployed 7 submarines off Japanese naval bases in Formosa, Hainan, and Indochina, 10 boats to the north and east of Luzon and in the inter-island waters to the south of Luzon, and 6 boats in defensive areas on the west coast of Luzon. Only 2 of these boats were underway when the war began. By December 11th, 23 submarines were at sea for operations against the enemy. On December 10th, Hart directed Doyle to turn command of CSAF back to Wilkes and take Holland and several other ships south to escape. The implication was clear. Hart had not been satisfied with Doyle's performance in command. Doyle had been insecure in Hart's presence, and while his staff should have been getting into a rhythm with their new organization, instead they wasted half their day preparing Doyle for disastrous meetings to brief Hart. Later that day, Japanese bombers appeared in the empty skies over Manila. Unhurried precision, they destroyed the Cavite Navy Yard, sinking 1 submarine and damaging another. Back in command, Wilkes split the CSAF staff into 2 teams, leading one group while Fife led the other. They shared duties around the clock to monitor and direct the operations of their submarines. Daily bombing raids interrupted the staff's work, and I would have to say that diving headfirst into slit trenches is not a standard skill set for a submariner. And also forced the submarines in Manila Bay to bottom during the attacks, disrupting repairs and provisioning and further exhausting the crews. Without air protection, the days of operating submarines from Manila were numbered. CSAF submarines had little effect on preliminary landings on Luzon. When the main invasion materialized at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd, the invasion convoy was sighted by Stingray, who reported but failed to attack. Wilkes ordered several boats to converge on the Gulf and attack, dispensing with area restrictions designed to keep the boats apart to prevent fratricide. But by that time, it was too late. Aggressive convoy escorts repelled boats attempting to enter the Gulf. Only S-38 was able to penetrate and sink 1 ship. Wilkes's submarine failed to attrite or impede the largest enemy invasion convoy of the war. As Japanese troops rapidly moved south, MacArthur declared Manila an open city on the 24th. Hart departed Manila by submarine for Surabaya on the island of Java the next day, looking to prepare for the next phase of the campaign, the fight for the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, some of the boats returning from their initial patrols slide instances of defective torpedoes and attacking targets that should have produced hits, but did not. By the end of December, U.S. submarines had sunk only 3 Japanese ships. After 3 weeks, the submarines had not slowed the enemy advances, and ominously, there were indications of defective torpedoes and missed shots on perfectly set up short-range attacks. Wilkes ordered the evacuation of his boats from Manila, taking as many spare parts and torpedoes as they could. His team rode Swordfish south to Surabaya, a major Dutch naval base, while Fife and his team rode Seawolf to Port Darwin, Australia, where Holland had established herself. Fife noted that this was done so that in case one group was lost, the command could have continued. A week after reaching their destinations, Wilkes ordered Fife to Surabaya to reconstitute the staff. Hart and Wilkes had directed the boats how and when they should depart their patrol stations in the north and begin repositioning south. As food and water stocks depleted or material casualties mounted, one by one, the boats left their stations to transit south to resupply and prepare for their next patrols. The shift of the playing field from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies brought new challenges. There were many seas and straits nestled among thousands of islands, and dangerous reefs amidst the poorly charted waterways. Another challenge was coordinating with the Allies, as the Americans, British, Dutch, and Australians combined their forces under the new ABDA command. Wilkes's submariners also now faced an uncertain supply and repair situation. Meanwhile, the enemy had the initiative, overwhelming numbers, and command of the air. They It kept the submarines off balance, preventing them from concentrating against any one thrust. Geography gifted the Japanese 3 distinct approaches to Java. From the western side of Borneo, go back one more, go back another one, go back another one, go back. Okay, go ahead. Next. We'll stay there. So they had to come through the west of Borneo, between Borneo and Celebes, and an eastern route through the Malacca Passage east of Celebes. Japanese used all 3 routes to spread out Wilkes's boats. The Eastern Force landed in Celebes on January 11th, and the Center Force took Tarakan and eastern Borneo on the same day. Less than 2 weeks later, they landed at the oil fields of Balikpapan. CSAF had deployed 6 submarines to contest the landings there, hoping to finally achieve some significant success. But as Fife later said, the failure to sink any ships was the greatest disappointment that any of us ever had. On the 24th, the Eastern Force took the port of Kandari on southwest Celebes. As February arrived, the pace quickened. The Eastern Force took Makassar City in southwest Celebes on the 5th, Bali on the 18th, and Timor on the 20th. Massive land-based and carrier air raids on Darwin on the 19th made that port unusable. Fortunately, the last submarine that departed Darwin on February 5th, and Holland was in Cilacap in southern Java. By this point, Surabaya was being bombed almost daily. The Western Force attacked Sumatra on the 14th, and when Singapore surrendered the next day, it was clear where the enemy pincers would converge next. As ABDA surface naval forces girded themselves for the oncoming onslaught, CSAF closed defensive submarine patrols into the Java Sea. By late February, Wilkes had positioned 16 boats in the Java Sea and adjacent areas. The Asiatic Fleet submarines did not affect the final battles of the Java Sea and Sunda Strait, in which the ABDA naval forces were thoroughly defeated. The best the submarines could contribute was S-38's rescue of survivors from a British destroyer. Wilkes recognized the need to evacuate the CSAF staff once again and the eventual retreat of his submarines to Australia. He ordered Fife to take Holland to Western Australia to find a suitable submarine base. With Surabaya untenable due to the air raids, the boats didn't refit there and at Cilacap proceeded south to Australia, as did boats returning from lengthy patrols. It was time to retreat and regroup. Wilkes boarded Spearfish on March 2nd at Cilacap and headed south. By March 20th, 19 of the remaining 25 Asiatic Fleet submarines had arrived at Fremantle, selected as the best location for basing the boats. The boats were repaired and crews received short and unsatisfying breathers before going back on patrol, Sculpin being the first to depart on March 13th. Wilkes and Fife were now faced with the task of establishing proper basing and maintenance, a program for providing sufficient crew rest to recover between patrols, and perhaps most importantly, to determine the lessons of the previous 3 months. An evaluation of Asiatic Fleet submarine leadership must look at 3 things in general: pre-war preparations, the execution of their responsibilities during the campaign, and how they had assessed and adjusted to improve submarine performance following the campaign. Pre-war factors that reflect on CSAF leadership include training and maintaining material condition of the boats, organizing the staff for success, and preparing an operational plan for war. Wilkes has been criticized for inadequate training before the war. However, he trained his crews hard in early 1941 and focused on familiarizing them with the waters of the southern Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Some of his commanding officers thought Wilkes did not pay enough attention to maintenance or the material condition of his boats. But, repairs are complicated by the long logistics trail from the U.S. to the Philippines. Fife said the maintenance and repair in the Philippines had never been completely adequate, and it's doubtful that much could have been done to improve the situation. Hart and Wilkes get high marks for restructuring the squadrons into a CSAF organization that are able to support wartime operations. But doing so earlier might have allowed the new organization to settle into a good routine rather than having to figure it all out amidst the crucible of war. In fairness, many of the key players, Fife, Doyle, and his division commanders, did not arrive until November. Hart can be blamed for not deploying his submarines when war seemed imminent in late November and early December. Some have contended that he was hamstrung by war warning messages that cautioned against an accidental first shot or provoking the Japanese. But Wilkes sent submarines to screen transports, bringing the 4th Marines from Shanghai to Manila in late November, while under the close observation of Japanese warships, without provoking adverse reactions or any trigger-happy incidents. I would argue that it was a mistake to only have 2 boats at sea when the war started. Once at war, the most important things the CSAF staff could do were provide the boats with intelligence on enemy movements and direct them to areas where they could attack enemy forces. Unfortunately, one thing they could not do was give the boats reliable torpedoes. Unacceptable pre-war deployment, testing, and evaluation of the Mark 14 torpedo and the Mark 6 magnetic exploder was to plague the boats throughout the first 18 months of the war. To Wilkes's credit, he listened to his skippers and identified the problem to the Bureau of Ordnance in January 1942. It didn't get fixed until May 1943. They dismissed his concerns, ensuring continued frustration, missed opportunities, and costing the loss of boats and crews. The loss of control of the skies early in the war would prove to be a serious setback. Without aerial reconnaissance, CSAF lacked the primary means of cueing to best position their assets. This would ensure that Wilkes submarines would be, to use a submariner term, chasing the bubble. They were reactive, not proactive, in their operations. The staff did a better job of maintaining communications with the boats and supporting their supply and repairs to keep them operating under difficult circumstances. Wilkes faced some critical decisions during the campaign. He deserves criticism for not sending more submarines into the fight against the Lingayen invasion. However, he showed excellent control and forethought in evacuating from Manila and Java. While forced upon him by necessity, both situations were professionally accomplished under difficult circumstances. The haphazard manner in which the boat shifted south after the staff evacuated Manila was problematic, but to be fair, the entire staff was at sea for a week, scurrying southward, out of touch with the operational situation. The decision to send boats to operate out of Darwin should have been more carefully considered. Wilkes thought that that was where the majority of the boats would be based, but its distance from Hart and the ultimate Japanese objective of Java, as well as the lack of consideration for the political implications from the Dutch perspective, led to a rapid reversal to operate out of Surabaya. One of Wilkes' more important duties was to ensure his skippers were aggressively pressing attacks to deal damage to the enemy. Those who did not were relieved. During the campaign, Wilkes relieved 8 commanding officers, 4 for lack of results, or what he termed temperamental inaptitude, 3 at their own request, and 1 for medical reasons. Although these decisions were closely scrutinized, one skipper stated, "I don't know a single one who didn't deserve to be relieved." Once the campaign ended in defeat and retreat to Australia, let's go again, CSAF adapted quickly, established basing and processes, and began sending boats back on patrol. What really stands out, however, was their efforts to assess the events of the previous 4 months and promulgate recommendations and implement changes. Fife practically locked himself up for a month to write an extraordinary 72-page action report. This was delivered to the Chief of Naval Operations in April 1942. The document is a marvel of frank assessment and insightful recommendations to operate the submarines with better results in future operations. Tommy Hart was not there for the demise of his Asiatic fleet. He was recalled in mid-February, replaced through backdoor maneuvering for President Roosevelt by Dutch Vice Admiral Conrad Helfer. Red Doyle departed Fremantle for the U.S. aboard a transport in March 1942, retiring quietly in 1943. John Wilkes would go on to achieve flag rank, but he had no further service with the submarine forces during the war. Instead, he was an important factor in preparing the landing forces for the invasion of Normandy. The one senior Asiatic Fleet submarine leader who continued to contribute to the submarine war against Japan was Jimmy Fife. He commanded all submarine operations out of Brisbane before returning to Fremantle to command the submarine forces of the 7th Fleet for the remainder of the war. John Wilkes and Jimmy Fife had different personalities and leadership styles, but they complemented each other as they guided the submarines of the Asiatic fleet through tumultuous events. It's a tribute to the strength of their teamwork that they were able to control so many submarines across such a vast expanse of ocean under adverse and constantly changing circumstances, giving the boats opportunities to be in position to confront the enemy. No less praiseworthy are Wilkes's raising the red flag about torpedo performance only a month into the war, and Fife's efforts and dedication to write the insightful report that so accurately captured the lessons of those chaotic months. These senior officers proved their mettle by exercising solid leadership during a period of retreat and failure. Thank you.
This is a very well-attended panel. There's not a lot of space in this room. There are also 21 people online watching this panel, which I think is very impressive. Speaking of that, can we turn the chat on? Ladies and gentlemen, in the virtual world, if you have any questions, please post them to the chat, and I will get to them when we get to the Q&A. Please and thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I want to thank the presenters, both here and across the Pacific, for delivering 3 very, very good, very well-researched, very well-articulated papers. How do military institutions learn and adapt? What are the driving forces behind that learning? How do leaders use their past experiences, their history really, to guide this learning process, to become more efficient, more lethal, and better able to survive? I think all 3 papers that we have heard today address these questions in some form, fashion. Beginning with Yip Cummings' paper on the Zuikaku. He invited all of us to Google the Zuikaku for some of its history, and I did, because the name the Zuikaku was familiar to me. I'm not an expert on the Imperial Japanese Navy, but as someone who has taught naval and Marine Corps history here, something about that ship seemed familiar. Well, it's a very powerful warship. It was probably one of the more advanced aircraft carriers in the world until the U.S. Essex class came out. This ship participated in the strike against Pearl Harbor, but it also participated in pretty much every major naval engagement except Midway. That includes the actions in the Solomons in 1942, where she helped damage the USS Enterprise, and she helped cripple the USS Hornet, and she made life hell for Marines at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. That ship, that aircraft carrier, finally sunk in 1944. Yip Cummings, talks about how this was the last of the 6 Pearl Harbor carriers to be sunk. I think his paper asked important questions and relevant questions about how sailors learn from their battle experiences and how they implemented those lessons learned, how those very lessons can be negatively impacted by outside forces outside of everyone's control. He argues that despite being a powerful warship manned with experienced crews, the Zuikaku suffered from systemic problems that perhaps affected all of the Imperial Japanese Navy, namely lack of resources and dwindling time. In the face of an enemy with the power to build the largest navy the world had yet seen from its industrial and manufacturing base. Having to do increasingly more with decreasing resources and decreasing time, combat efficiency, the ability to train and learn on the fly is going to suffers the ship. The author's use of the Imperial Japanese Navy after actions reports is a superb use in using evidence and exploring these questions. He goes through the ship's experiences in Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is what I always enjoy talking to midshipmen about. In this particular battle, some of you are aware, but so those of you who are not, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 carriers in this fight and 600 aircraft, around 3,000 killed in action in that battle. This was the big naval battle that was going on right around the same time as the invasion of Saipan, to put that in perspective for some of you. Now, what the Japanese Navy, or what the crew of the Zuikaku decided to do after this, was increase fighter escorts and attack air groups. More night training for pilots for dawn and dusk operations. More communication training for IGN pilots. Greater use of scout planes in the absence of airborne radar and things of that nature. Upcoming talks about the battle off of Cape Engano on October 25th, 1944, which was a part of a larger Leyte Gulf campaign. The author points out that the crew of the Zuikaku increased their anti-aircraft guns and improved their damage control abilities. But one of the interesting things about this, and he points this out, is that despite all the things that they've tried to do in terms of training, in terms of getting more efficient for the next battle, more anti-aircraft guns, more patrols, more using pilots in different ways, communication, all that kind of stuff. One 250-kilogram bomb disables the entire ship. One. Effectively knocked the carrier out of action. It took out its electricity, which disabled steering, severely hampered the effectiveness of the anti-aircraft guns, and negatively impacted the ship's ability to communicate not only with itself but to other ships. So the questions I have for Cater about this paper, and I want Cater to get to them when I'm done with the comments. So write these down as I say them, I guess. Was the damage that the Zuikaku received the result of a design flaw? Like the extent of the damage? It's not a design flaw that it got hit by a bomb, but the extent of the damage, was that a design flaw? Or was it the result of, was it simply a reflection of improved torpedo technology and U.S. tactics at the time? So this is 1944. I'm not talking about 1941 or 1942. Was this improved U.S. Technology and tactics, or was it a design flaw? Also, with that 250-kilogram bomb hit, which effectively took out the ship, to what extent was that bad luck? Despite all the training and despite all the things they tried to do to prepare themselves for the next battle, was there any training or any prior arrangements that could have better prepared them for that, or maybe perhaps led to a different outcome in a situation like that? Moving on to Himmler's paper, Destroying Iwo Jima. Now, Himmler begins with an indelible scene. Everybody is aware of the Joe Rosenthal photograph of those Marines and one corpsman from 2nd Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment as they raised the second flag atop Iwo Jima. These infantrymen did not accomplish this feat alone. Chris argues, rather, it took the full weight of American trifibious forces, that of land, sea, and air, to overwhelm the enemy. Now, I think one of the reasons why he's making this argument is historiographical. Marine infantry on Iwo Jima receive a lot of attention, rightfully so. I'm a former infantryman myself. I get it. While many histories account for the heroic efforts of the Marine infantry from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, Himmler spotlights the efforts of naval artillery, close air support, that made defending Iwo Jima a truly hellish experience for the Japanese. The Navy and Marine victory at Iwo Jima is the result of brave infantrymen and very sophisticated and innovative fire and support coordination and control. This coordination, indeed the ability to rain a hailstorm of high explosive rounds on Japanese positions, came through several years of trial and error across the Solomons and the Central Pacific. Now, conference papers are where nuance and context go to die. You only have 20 minutes to talk about these things. But I do know from attending Works in Progress and just talking to Chris here, that a big part of his research deals with this learning process over the war. So one of the central themes of his work is how the Marines and the Navy learned to use and coordinate more deadly and efficient fires in support of infantry assaulting the beach. By 1945, Marines, particularly Don Weller, who he spends time talking about, came up with a naval rolling barrage, inspired by the rolling barrages of World War I. Naval gunners would creep their fire up the beach, synchronized in relation to the position of the landing forces. I've always been curious how that works with the ship going like this, how they're able to aim as accurately as possible. Because, you know, rolling barrage from the ground obviously is very different from a boat that's just doing that. That's not an official question. You can talk about that if you want to or not. But
stable zenith.
Say again?
It's called a stable zenith.
Stable zenith.
It's an instrument on the ship
Ah,
that maintains the stability of the gun in relation to the target.
there you go.
You cross that off your list.
Talk about that in your presentation. So as the troops moved forward, the barrage would roll further inland throughout the initial landing stage. So by focusing on this, the story becomes one not just of the infantry, but of fire control parties, forward observers, liaison officers, rather than just the infantry. Now, the Marines landed on Iwo Jima with lots of guns, lots of grenades, lots of flamethrowers, lots of photographers. They had film crews and their own liaison officers and their own forward observers and their fire control parties. These are things that the grunts needed for accurate and effective fire support. He also talks about air, talking about air support at Iwo.
We can't hear you.
Okay, is the it has nothing to do with mic.
Well, no, it's not.
The mic's off.
No, the mic's on.
Can everybody hear me? Can no one in the virtual world hear me?
I don't know about
I can hear you.
I hear it's fine.
I can hear you.
One person who can't hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you too, just fine.
Okay. So, not only did all this naval gunnery and air support help the Marines establish a beachhead, it also sustained them through what Chris aptly describes as, quote, the monotonous cycle of violence that raged ashore throughout most of the month of 1945. Teaching Iwo Jima to midshipmen here was very, very interesting. On paper, Iwo Jima looks like a very clean-cut, neat campaign. We have air and naval superiority. You show a map, you get the 3rd, 4th, 5th Marine divisions, they cut across the island, then they turn to the right, and they just battle their way across the island. It looks really neat, but in order to teach midshipmen anything about that, you really have to get into the nitty-gritty where it becomes evident that it was anything but neat, okay? And Chris Himmler talks about this very, very well in his paper. Clearing bunkers is an incredibly risky business. First, you had to locate them. Then you had to locate any that were mutually supporting them. Then you had to determine ways to knock out one or several of them at a time, depending on the situation. Come up with avenues of approach and ways to implement covering fire. Every pillbox and every bunker was its own unique problem that Marines had to figure out and deal with. And the tools in the infantryman's arsenal for this were rifles, a lot of hand grenades, flamethrowers, satchel charges, tanks, and as much air support and artillery that they could get. And Chris Himmler talks about this and sheds light on this very, very effectively. So based on Chris's excellent use of firsthand accounts, describing how frequently Marines, quote, clung to American air and naval fire support to ease their demanding task on Iwo Jima, end quote. I don't think any Marine who survived Iwo would argue with Chris's point, which is how indispensable air support was for the infantry to do their job. I think my favorite quotation and a great use of evidence in this paper is when Chris quotes Lieutenant General Kobayashi. I'm not afraid of the fighting power of only 3 Marine divisions. If there are no bombardments, there are no aircrafts, and no warships. It's the only reason why we see such a miserable situation. That's a very good quote that really makes his overall point very, very well towards the end of the paper. So, questions I would have for Chris, just right off the bat. Explain a little bit how the sophisticated fire support evolved over time. Just a smidge. I know you could probably talk about that for 3 days, and you will talk about that in your dissertation defense in October. So to consider this as like prep for that. So that's one question. So what does your research tell us about how the evolution, what does your research tell us about the evolution of doctrine and war over time? In particular, I'm talking about the TMLO, Tended Manual Landing Operations. What kind of impact does your research have on interpretations of that history? I've got a third question for you, but I'm going to ask that same question for everybody. Jim Ramson's paper. Jim Ransom's paper examines the performance of the Asiatic Fleet staff at Manila, operating out of Luzon, particularly Commander John Wilkes, USNA 1916, and Commander James Fife, USNA class of 1918. He argues that these officers deserve to be commended for their for preparing the fleet as much as they could for war under extreme duress, reassessing and adapting, quote, as events unfolded, and in assessing submarine performance and recommended changes. In a word, how these officers learn on the fly. From 8 December 1941 to March 1942, Ransom recounts how the Asiatic Fleet, along with his staff, had to abandon Manila in the face of the Japanese own trifibious assault on Luzon, a city and an island that would not be taken back until 1945. The Army is going to be fighting from January to August 1945 to retake that island. So the Japanese air superiority and, mixed with the treacherous maritime terrain ensured that the submarine fleet had little impact on the Java Sea, and the Sunda Strait, in which American, British, Canadian, and Dutch combined force received the worst of it. The entire submarine fleet had to relocate to Fremantle, Australia, which he points out. From there, they could lick their wounds and prepare to get back to the war. Now, Ransom rightly takes Hart and Wilkes to task on key issues, such as only having 2 boats at sea when the war started, not sending submarines effectively, or not sending enough submarines, or their submarines not being able to affect the landing at the Lingayen Gulf, the Japanese landing at Lingayen Gulf. That was a unfortunate affair for the Americans. But he gives them high marks for, quote, their efforts to assess the events of the previous months and promulgate recommendations and implement changes. So one of the strong points of this paper, coming from a military or naval history standpoint, also in terms of communicating audiences the value of this type of history, one thing I think Jim Ransom does very well is when you're criticizing leadership, it's not enough to say, this guy screwed up. This is why this person's wrong. It's always more helpful for me as an audience member and as a student of military history to say, this person screwed up, but this is why they made this decision. These are the options that they had in front of them. They made this decision based on this list of options. Yes, we can criticize them because we're trying to learn from their mistakes. However, it's also very, very important to help audiences understand why they made that choice out of the list of options that they had. And I think Jim Ransom does that very, very effectively. So my question is for Jim. What was in Jimmy Fife's report? You said you mentioned that in a paper that you gave 2 years ago. If you could speak to that a little bit, that would be very, very interesting. To what extent was it valuable to the Asiatic Fleet in subsequent operations? And a question that I have for all 3 presenters. What would you say is the takeaway of your research for naval officers today as they prepare for peer competition in the Pacific? Once again, I would like to hear from Cater first, then Chris, then Jim, and from there we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the presenters for 3 great papers. Peter, you're up.
Oh, well, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, well, the first question about the damage Drekago received it. Well, I would say it is a result of the limitations of the design of the carrier, and also it showed the improved tactics of the United States Navy. Well, I'm not quite familiar with the development and advancement of the USN aerial torpedoes at the time, so I could not answer about that. But, well, if I have remembered correctly, the 4th generator room was located quite close to the propellant staff of the ship. And that part was always the most weak torpedo defense system of the ship. So, in fact, a torpedo hitting that position could deal massive damages to the ship, and which was just like Drekago had suffered in the battle. But however, I would argue that it is more or less the advanced USN tactics, since according to the after-action report of the Japanese, the first wave they counted was about 50 attack aircraft. If they were attacking from the same position in an air group, it would be an easy target even for the AA defense system of the carrier. But however, in the battle, which the Japanese officers also specifically mentioned about that, was the United States Navy airmen attacked the aircraft all around from different directions simultaneously. And as the carrier only had a very limited direct anti-aircraft director, it could only manage to engage a limited amount of the targets, and such tactics would simply just overrun the AA defense system. And I think that it also contributes to the hit of the torpedo, since if you just attack from the same direction, and it would be relatively easier for the ship to dodge the torpedoes, or well, I doubled if it could score a hit quite easily. And for the 250 kilogram bombs hit, well, I would say it would be quite bad luck. But however, well, since it perfectly hit on the port side on top of a group of the 25mm AA gun, since the Japanese don't have the VT views and they don't have the 40 meters buffers, and they only have either the 5-inch guns or the 25mm AA, and when the torpedo bombers get into such a close position, the 5-inch guns were entirely useless, and the 25mm guns was the last resort, and such the last resort was called out 2 minutes before the torpedoes hit. And although the report didn't tell me about that, and I could not prove that, but an educated guess was that the 25mm guns were caught out, and it had paved the way for the torpedoes bombers to do their job more easily. So, well, it would be a backlash, but however, which the Japanese did not enjoy such an advantage, if they could have a slightly more proper director for the 25mm guns, just like what the 20mm Olicon guns had, they might have a slightest chance to survive longer. But well, to a large extent, it was a bad luck, I would say, if I could say that.
Okay.
And for the third question, I answer it now. Well, if I have to answer this question, maybe I have to talk slightly more about my research. My research was about the war experience and the lesson learning of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And the reason inspired me to dig into such a topic was that I think all of us here would agree that lesson learning is very critical and very important for not only military armed forces and also for all the organization and even in the person. But however, how we could judge an experience is correct or is right or is useful for the future, and even if an experience was adopted, how can we ensure that the experience, which we don't know if it is really correct, would not consume the resources that may have another use? And I think, as I'm not a military person, no, I'm just a civilian sitting in the other side of the Pacific. I'm not familiar with the military technology or else. I just read them on the book. But however, I think that my research could provide some inspiration to reveal the war experience and the battles, the campaigns in the past with a more thoughtful aspect. Well, I think it is my 2 cents for the military audience or for the academia.
Thank you. Chris?
I'll try to be as brief as I can
Take your mask off.
in the interest of time. To give the whole story of wartime lesson learning would betray the purpose of my dissertation if I give it here. So I would never sell a book in the future. But this is certainly a story of wartime adaptation. All armies and navies adapt at war. That there couldn't be higher incentive, right? Kill or be killed. But the 5th Amphibious Corps did it better than I think most comparable accounts. This was a very difficult problem that was on display at the Battle of Tarawa in 1943, where coordination was abysmal. And so my dissertation explores that story between Tarawa and Iwo Jima. And so this presentation here captured the bookend of the project. The Fifth Corps was slated to attack Kyushu in the slated landing of the Japanese home islands, and so there would have been another chapter there. But of course, the end of the war came, and those, I'd refer you to Richard Frank's terrific book, Downfall, on that planning and that context. But it's absolutely a story of wartime adaptation, lesson learning over time, adjustments made in stride. Two particular items I'd point out to you. Weller himself, Donald Weller, helps to stand up a naval gunfire training section in Hawaii during the war, established in '43, and it'll train more than 800 American ships on their way to the Pacific. That is really what I would argue that is the hub of this lesson learning, as ships are transiting on their way to combat. They're also training the shore fire control parties there. So lessons are being absorbed in stride through the after action reports that can feel quite monotonous to a staff officer assigned to complete them, but were invaluable to the progress of this particular this coordination. The other item I'd point out to you, I referenced in the paper, but don't talk at length, the Joint Assault Signal Company. This is introduced in '43. It is the owning agency of both the air control teams and the naval gunfire control teams, as well as a repertoire of communication specialists, right? If the radios don't work, you can't find success in this endeavor. So the JASCO units were instrumental. They pick up a lot of attention, a lot of personnel, resources after the tough experience on Tarawa. And those particular companies, there was one JASCO assigned to each Marine infantry division, and they were instrumental in facilitating this successful coordination. The second question is on doctrine in war, right? And Mark talks about the tentative manual for landing operations. By almost any gauge, a remarkable document that the Marines produced in the 1930s, but it wasn't the complete solution, right? So the phrase that I've absorbed in my Marine Corps career is that doctrine is the starting point, and that is quite true of the tentative manual and this search for coordination, right? So it took the lessons of the war. I would argue that the tentative manual, as it related to coordination of supporting arms, was too prescriptive, too formulaic, and too optimistic. And so it took the battle lessons for the Fifth Corps to achieve progress there. Just one figure that I like to point to: the tentative manual spent 11 pages talking about naval gunfire ammunition, fuse combinations, and gunnery techniques, but it spent just 1.5 pages talking about shore fire control teams and coordination at the beachhead. What I would argue is a much more difficult problem than the fuse combo and the ammunition choice. So just a blind spot there, I think, for the tentative manual. Finally, lessons for today. I don't think my answer would be unsurprising or unoriginal. I think it is both unsurprising and unoriginal. Interagency coordination is critical, absolutely critical, especially in the heat of battle. And I choose the word coordination deliberately. Cooperation is not enough. Coordination it has to be the aim. And so getting distinct units, whether they are aviators and infantrymen or naval gunners and shore fire control parties, everyone has got to work together. A spirit of cooperation is one of the quotes I borrow in my dissertation from one of the staff officers. He's longing for a spirit of cooperation amongst these different units, and it takes a lot of time for them to work out that harmony. But they do achieve it rather well. So I would say the lesson is that trust and credibility are at the forefront of coordination, of interagency coordination. It unfortunately took some bloody lessons for the Fifth Corps to achieve that trust and credibility across the entire task force.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Good questions, Mark. First, the Wilkes report. I didn't want to go into that because it wasn't about that. That was just one piece of it. So I asked you all to press the I believe button. You said it was a good document. It must have been a good document. Was anybody here at the talk that I gave 2 years ago? I got one groupie. Okay, so one groupie. So I did spend a lot of time talking about that. But basically, it covered the narrative, which was very important. And Fite wrote it from memory. These guys were operating with like spiral wound notebooks. They didn't have all these documents. And when they had to pack up to go from Manila to whatever, they stuck some papers in their pockets and that's it. So he did a phenomenal job of putting it all together. But a big part of why that document was so useful is he talked about positioning the boats. They were sending the boats to the departure points from the Japanese ports, and they were putting them right off where they thought they were going to be needed, the landing areas, the Lingayen Gulf. And they really weren't in between. And they determined that, hey, by the time they get to the landing point, it's shallow water, you've got all these escorts, it's going to be really hard for the boats to do their job. So put them out in the middle in the transit lanes where they can intercept them from there. So that was probably the most important thing. Also provide a really good assessment of the Japanese. I mean, let's face it, the United States Navy and the submarine force in particular underestimated their enemy. They really didn't know that they didn't know they had sonar. They didn't know they were so good at night fighting. In fact, the Japanese were so good at night fighting, they thought they had radar. They came back and said, well, they've got radar. They picked us up on radar all the time. No, they had better lookouts. They had better binoculars. So it provided a good assessment of the Japanese. It also gave the idea some good modifications that needed to be implemented for the American boats. 1, cut down their silhouettes. 2, give them radar. Put radar on the boats because they weren't anyone had started off. And several other modifications that really allowed the boats to do better jobs on long patrols. And I guess the other big thing is management of the skippers. The whole idea of, some of these guys are going to do well. Some of them may not do well. Some of them were great at operating in peacetime, but can they handle that ship to war? Which jumps right into your second question, which is, what would I pass on to naval officers today? For current naval officers, you have to be ready. Okay, we do all this training, and lots of times we kind of joke, oh, we're going out to sea, it's dumb. The training was dumb or wasn't useful, but you will not know, the next time the balloon goes up, you may not have lots of time to gird your loins, so to speak, to be ready to take that onslaught. So you've got to take it seriously. You have to be an absolute professional, and you've got to be ready for that instantaneous shift from peacetime to war. And for the submariners in particular, and I know I've got 1, 2, 3, I've got the father of another budding young ensign submariner, and there may be others. What I tell you guys is, remember, I'm not going to get religious here, but I'm going to put it in terms of scripture, right? You've all heard, what is it? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Fear no evil because you're the meanest, baddest person in that valley. And you've got to take that with you. And one of the things that we do now, I talked very briefly about the Mark 14 torpedo and the total scandalous events that did that cost Americans lives, untold number of submarines sunk because of that. Well, we learned from that. And I shot more torpedoes. You guys have probably shot more torpedoes than I have, okay? Not on one boom and sent stuff to the bottom, but with the exception of the warhead, it's the torpedo you're going to take to war. So have that confidence that your country is giving you that and giving you this great platform and the best guys out there to man it.
Great, excellent. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Chris, for you, the Battle of Iwo Jima was largely a seasoned airfield, or to create an airfield on that battle. How much did the U.S. Army Air Forces support pre-invasion bombardment for their eventual target?
They support it quite a bit, and the figure is, it's not really in the scope of my research, but the tons of bombs that the Army facilitates in the, I think it's about 36 or 37 days of preliminary aerial bombardment prior to 3 days of naval shelling. But at the end of the day, it is still only marginally effective, right? Because Kurabayashi's defensive system is the finest scheme you could have developed under those circumstances, and the Japanese defenses, resist so much of that punishment from the air.
The Army Air Corps starts bombing Iwo Jima like in December, and
It's an
January.
extended.
Yeah. I saw your hand. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was just, this is more of a notes and queries sort of thing in military. So I was wondering, do you remember where the term trifibious came from? Because I swear I read it, Churchill made it up in the First World War or something.
Trifibious. So I've been on the hunt for the original use. Churchill uses it in his books on World War II, series on World War II. I found it in a proceedings article by a lieutenant commander in 1944. I can't quite tell if Churchill had already used it on, in a public capacity, but it's swirling in there. And if there's First World War evidence, I would love to have it. I haven't seen it.
I don't know. I just know. I just remember it was a Churchillian word.
It certainly is. It certainly is.
Any other questions?
You actually refer to a U.S. Navy surface warship at one point as a boat.
I did
He did.
I did hear that.
He
Yes,
did.
yes, he did.
I mean, they're all boats.
No, they're not.
You have big boats, you have little boats.
Only the submarine. Giant boats.
Boat.
Hello, Josephine here. A very quick question. Did the surface ships, the destroyers, cruisers, have the same torpedoes at the beginning of the war that the submarines did? I don't know the answer to that.
It was a different mark. I think they had Mark 15s or Mark 13s. I can't remember what it is. But
15 was the surface, 13 was the aerial.
yeah, so they didn't have but they didn't have the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, which was good for them.
They still didn't work all that well, like when they had the Scuttle of Horn, they had to fire like 20 torpedoes at it. And not just because the ship was starting to sink, but because they kept getting duds.
Yes, sir. You got a question?
I came in late, so I apologize if you already said this. Did the Mark 14, I recently read it sank at least 2 submarines we know of? Is that
Two that we know of, Tang and Tulby, I think were both for sure sunk by their own torpedoes.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Just as a quick note, as the former director of the MacArthur Memorial, Trifibious started in MacArthur's headquarters, which I know for Marines is not something that they may want to admit, but it was what they came up with for joint sea, air, land operations. And if you read anything about the Southwest Pacific area, 43 to 45, that word comes up fairly quickly. My question actually relates to the paper about Iwo Jima, and I was curious what these lessons, if any of these lessons were incorporated into the fighting on Okinawa 3rd Amphibious Corps.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. The detail there from MacArthur's headquarters, right? I'm searching for the evidence, so I'll take the evidence even if it breaks my Marine heart. Yes and no. I think the lessons are applied indirectly at Okinawa. The JASCOs are there serving at the division level, but I would say that the information sharing is not as effective as it should have been because you're crossing command lines now. The 5th Amphibious Corps does not participate at Okinawa, and so it could have been better. But the supporting arms tent does continue once ashore at Okinawa, and the JASCOs are there serving at the division level. And you can make the same argument for the Army and Marine Corps more generally sharing lessons in the Normandy campaign, and probably what should have been a better sharing of lessons.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all of our time. Thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause for the
No, we're good. We're good.
Did a great job. Okay, you did a fabulous delivery.
Thank you very much.
19 minutes.
I've